Ontario's Minister of Finance, Peter Bethlen-Falvey, presented the government's budget for 2022. Coming up today on the program, exclusive reaction to this new budget that the Progressive Conservatives will largely be campaigning on in the upcoming provincial election. Starting things off, to get the perspective of the NDP official opposition, I'll speak to that party's finance critic, Catherine Fife. To get the perspective of the Ontario Liberal Party, I'll be joined by former Ontario Liberal leadership candidate, as well as Liberal commentator and basic income advocate, Alvin Tedjo. Then, in a special panel discussion, I'll be joined by Tim Powers, chairperson of Summa Strategies, where he'll provide the conservative perspective. And also on that panel, I'll be joined by Allison Jones, reporter for the Canadian Press. That is all coming up on this special Ontario budget edition of the Wyatt Sharp Show. Of course, the Ontario budget was presented in the Ontario legislature today. Joining me now for the Ontario NDP's reaction is that party's finance critic, Catherine Fife. MPP Fife, thanks so much for making the time. Perhaps we can just start out with your party's general reaction. I know your party put out a press release earlier today with some of your reaction to it, but perhaps just go a little bit more in detail as to, just again, your overall general reaction to the budget.
Well, first, let me say thank you very much, Wyatt, for having me on your show. I'm a huge admirer of you and what you're trying to do. So today's budget was really just dropped by the PC government, and then they adjourned and prorogued the House until September 12th. So if you are a government that's proud of the work that you are putting forward in this platform/budget, then you would stick around and you would share those details with people and let the democratic process play itself out by having a debate on this piece of legislation. You'll know that the government changed the rules on when they have to deliver the budget, and they introduced legislation so that they wouldn't have any financial penalties for introducing a late budget. That said, this is a platform that misses the mark on several fronts. And after going through a very trying time in the province of Ontario, the people of this province have been begging and asking the government to prioritize healthcare and education. Page 169 of this document, the government is cutting $1.3 billion from education. They're cutting almost $700 million from post-secondary education. And this is in-year cuts. So they've decided that this is just not a priority. On the cover of the document, I just want to point out for your listeners that there's pictures of a highway and some smog. And today I correctly pointed out that these are highways that lead to housing that is unaffordable for the people of the province. And so at the end of the day, this is a government that has failed to listen and learn through a very trying time in the history of our province, and then reflect those values back in this document.
And just quickly before you go, obviously one of, something that we didn't hear a whole lot of in the budget today, and even with kind of post-reaction to the budget as it relates to climate change and the environment, to what extent are you satisfied or unsatisfied with perhaps any, funding or environmental programs in the budget?
Yeah, this is really a government that has failed to recognize that there is a climate crisis and that there's opportunities to address the crisis and also strengthen the economy. The fact that they're prioritizing Highway 413 and the Bradford bypass and not costing those projects out really pushes down that key public infrastructure projects around public transit, around cycling infrastructure, which municipalities actually put on the front burner for this government. So once again, the government has not listened to the people and those leaders in those communities. And I'm thinking particularly of Brampton and the Ottawa LRT as well, that they've missed an opportunity to signal that they are serious about, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing car travel, and very focused on just paving over farmland and prioritizing those politically, expedient projects for them as a party instead of the real needs of the people that we serve.
Okay, NDP finance critic Catherine Fife, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Of course, the Minister of Finance, Peter Bethlenfalvy, presented Ontario Budget 2022 today. Joining me now to discuss that and more is Allison Jones, reporter for the Canadian Press based out of Queen's Park, and Tim Powers, chairperson at Summa Strategies. Thanks to the both of you for joining me. Allison, perhaps we'll start out with you. I mean, what was kind of, I guess, your big takeaway from the budget today? Obviously, it's going to be what the Progressive Conservatives will campaign on in the upcoming election. That's kind of what I guess the general narrative of the budget has been today, but maybe speak a little bit about that.
I think for me, the biggest surprise in there was the deficit projections. This government back in 2018, the Tories campaigned really hard on finding efficiencies and cutting government waste. And there was a whole central theme of their 2018 campaign, and it carried them through the first couple of years of government. We saw their 2019 budget just come with a slew of cuts. And, of course, in fairness, the pandemic changed a lot of priorities for a lot of people. But we had seen this government steadily chipping away at that pandemic deficit from, where it ballooned to in 2020, 2021. It had been steadily going down since then. And then all of a sudden, we see the projection for this year. We're way further back in the red, almost $20 billion due to a very, very large infrastructure spend. So I think seeing them go further into the red was sort of a big surprise for me. Maybe not exactly what I expected from a Tory budget.
And Tim, obviously, considering this is, again, as we've heard throughout today, going to be the budget that the Progressive Conservatives will probably largely use in the election campaign, do you think it was, big enough to be an election platform in the sense do you think there was something, or I guess, what do you think really stuck out as it relates to the budget?
Well, building off Allison's theme, it's pretty big. You have 196 billion reasons now, Wyatt, for all the money they're going to spend to vote for them. I mean, it's really fascinating, right, how politics has changed in a decade. Prior to Justin Trudeau winning federally in 2015, politics for 20 years was about who could best manage the federal budget, and that meant getting it, managing deficits, keeping them low, and getting surpluses. That doesn't matter anymore, it seems, at the moment, for a bunch of reasons. I think the Ford government telegraphed this budget for a very long time. You can't argue with what they're spending, but you do have to say, wow, that's a lot of money. If you've been on the 401 or the 416 or any of the major 400 roads, it's hard to argue about spending money on highways, hospitals, the same thing, given what we've learned here. So now Doug Ford is calculating that he doesn't need to be a fiscal conservative to win the next provincial election, and going this particular route, he thinks he'll probably attract more voters, is my guess.
And Allison, in terms of what, wasn't in the budget that some people would have liked to have seen in the budget, I mean, what are you hearing in terms of that? Obviously, I've heard some people say that, perhaps they would have liked to see, for example, more environmental programs in the budget, but maybe what else might you have wanted, or what else would people have wanted to see in the budget that, didn't seem to be there today? And do you think there's still an opportunity for, the PCs in the election to bring up other issues that weren't in the budget today?
Yeah, I think certainly the environment is a big area that some people have highlighted as lacking in the budget. And the finance minister was asked about it today during his media availability, and he really just pointed to their investments in the critical minerals strategy, the mining jobs, the push to get the critical minerals mined in the north to manufacture electric vehicle batteries in the south. He essentially said that is our green plan. So I think a lot of environmental groups had wanted to see more climate action from them. I think some education stakeholders were disappointed. They wanted to see more promises made on education. One thing that I was sort of surprised wasn't in the budget, frankly, was more pocketbook goodies. Mm-hmm. That was, again, another theme of their 2018 campaign, right? That was a lot of what we saw promised: income tax cut, promised gas tax cut, buck of beer, all those sorts of things. And this time around, there are a couple of things within that theme in the budget, but with very few exceptions, they're things that have already been announced. So really nothing, not a whole lot in that respect came across as new. So, they'll probably still campaign on it. Obviously, the vehicle, the license plate rebates, everyone got their checks. So that'll probably be a popular move that they'll keep going back to. But to your point, I've got to think that there's got to be more. There's got to be something else that they're going to bring out on the campaign trail.
And Tim, do you think it would be fair to say that the progressive conservatives are kind of hoping that, all of the economic promises that they've made may make up for, I guess, the lack thereof of, environmental programs in, the budget? And do you think voters on June 2nd on election day will, understand the fact that, well, yes, there may not be as many programs around areas like the environment, but, there's the license rebate and other economic promises? Do you think there's really a balance that can be found there?
I don't know if there's a balance, but I think it just picking up on something you said, Wyatt, I think people are still in this moment of coming out of the pandemic, and we're all in a different state of emotional vulnerability. And this budget tries to address with elements of those vulnerability. If it's, you're having trouble making ends meet and you're in a lower income bracket, well, there's something there for you. If you've got to drive to go to work, there's something there for you. If you found that healthcare didn't work well last time and the hospitals aren't efficient enough, there's something there for you. So I think they've also calculated that in the environmental values voters maybe not be will be where they are, but they will not have as widespread appeal, at least for this election, given we're coming out of the pandemic. I think the other thing they've quite frankly calculated, and I don't know if they're right or wrong on it, Allison would know better than I, she covers it on a daily basis, is that the opposition doesn't have the game to beat them, meaning that this is what Andrea Horwath's third or fourth election. Or what you're going to hear from Andrea Horwath, you've heard for the last four elections, they will argue, and that Stephen Del Duca isn't quite ready yet, and that it's hard to tell the NDP from the Liberals, and you've certainly heard that in the pre-spin. So I think they've created a document with the budget and read their opponents well enough to know that they can skate through to get a win, but strange things happen in elections.
Okay, Allison Jones of the Canadian Press and Tim Powers of Summa Strategies, thanks to you both for your time tonight and both of you for providing your insight.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Joining me now for the Ontario Liberals' reaction to the Ontario budget is Alvin Tedjo, who is a Liberal commentator and also an education, childcare, and basic income advocate. Alvin, thanks so much for making the time. When you look at the budget, even the press release that was released following the budget, you can tell that an election is near, in the sense of even the title of the press release that the government put out was titled Ontario's Plan to Build. And then they attached, 5 main points to the press release that they put out again after the budget. One of them they claim is rebuilding Ontario's economy, working for workers, building highways and key infrastructure, keeping costs down, and what they call a plan to stay open. How much credibility do you think there, is to, some of those points that, were in the budget and that were in some of the press release that I just read? And I guess just, again, your overall general reaction to the budget today.
Yeah, no, thanks, Wyatt. Those are some great questions. And thanks for having me on to talk about it. It's a super important issue right now when we've got an election imminently, probably in the next week, it'll be called, and then there'll be less than 36 days until election day. I don't think the government has a lot of credibility at all around this. Their budget announcement is a month to 2 months late. Under the government's own bill and own law that they wrote, they were supposed to table a budget almost 2 months ago, early March, and they decided not to. So everything that they put into this budget is make-believe, right? Everything they put into this announcement is all about what they promised they're going to do, but that they could have done a long time ago. They could have done this nearly 2 months ago if they had just followed through on their own promise, delivered the budget when it was supposed to be delivered on time. And then they would have been able to actually deliver and start doing some of the programs and some of the funding that they actually said they were going to do. So, you take a look at that and you sort of, Yeah, I get that this is going to be a platform that's really using taxpayer dollars to pay for the release so that people will be paying attention to it. And I get that it's an election year, but they had a responsibility that they ignored. In terms of the content and what they've put out there, I think it's actually pretty disappointing. They've rehashed all their old promises and everything that they said they were going to do over the last 3 to 4 months, but it didn't actually, they didn't actually start doing any of those things. And there was nothing new. There was nothing new. There was nothing visionary. There was nothing that would really capture the hearts and minds of voters over the next couple of weeks to actually vote for them. So I don't really know why they decided to just rehash old things. And, I think Ontarians are going to punish them for it ultimately.
In addition to that, I mean, what are, some of the other things that, maybe weren't a part of, the government's, again, what they call the Ontario's plan to build, which is, again, what they call a 5-pillar plan. Obviously, I'm sure the environment would be one of them, but maybe explain a little bit as to what other things you might have liked to have seen.
I mean, I like to say that you can tell a government's priorities by what they put at the top of their budget, at the top of their press release. And when you read it and when you listen to the minister talk today, for the first 5 minutes, he didn't once talk about healthcare. He didn't once talk about education. He didn't talk about seniors. He didn't talk about the pandemic. And so it goes to show you that that's not their priority. That's not reflected in the budget. And you can actually see cuts to the education sector. You can see not even meeting inflation to the healthcare sector. So they talk a big game in terms of how they're going to support hospitals and have new funding, but they've had 4 years. They've had 4 years to turn it around. We still have ridings in Scarborough, communities in Scarborough where their hospital, they get the least amount of money out of any hospital in the province. And that's something that the Ford government didn't pay any attention to.